Okay. So we got, I wanted to just share a little quote for you as something to kind of get you ready for what other people have experienced here with project management in Top Left. That's what we're talking about this week. So Sarah from a company called Clear Guidance, she once told us Top Left turned project management from staring at huge lists, possible stuff to prioritize, into easily digestible, very visually compelling information. No longer looking at a mountain of data and wondering how to break it up because it's already broken up for us by Top Left. So I don't know if you have experienced that with Top Left yet for your project management, but that is how we've helped people in the past. What we're gonna talk through today is visualizing the project portfolio on a Kanban board, basically looking at all the projects that you got going on at one time and trying to get some insight into that using Kanban methods for project management, and also identifying and fixing problematic projects and tickets using a Kanban board. It's kind of a review from last week on the service stuff, but we'll go through a little bit of that. And I got some tips and tricks that are good for MSPs who are using Top Left. I just want to review before we go into that stuff, though. I just want to do a quick review of what we heard from the last session, which was we talked about how to visualize service work using the Kanban boards. Talked about the triage and dispatch, and how some people do free-for-all kind of methods of dispatch, or the Tetris mode, which is stuffing everything into the calendar. So we had talked about that, and also, and instead of that, what do we do? How does triage and dispatch work in the service environment? You know, triage is making sure it's a good ticket and we treat it with the proper urgency, correcting any problems with the ticket before it can ever get into an engineer's hands. And dispatch is assigning someone to do that work, not necessarily putting it into the calendar, although that can happen depending on the type of the work. So we talked about the different methods of how do you get somebody assigned to a ticket? What are the options for doing that in agile methods? So we don't, just looking towards the project stuff. With project stuff, we don't do the normal triage, right? There are definitely big similarities for project work and service work, but one of the differences is what do you do at the beginning? Do you have to do a normal triage process? Well, no. It's triage is definitely going to be very different, but dispatch can sometimes be a lot in project environment. It can still be a lot like you might see in a service environment. And we also talked about monitoring and resolving problems in service work. So I wanted to know, how is it going? I know that you, I think a lot of you here are not really super concerned with the service side, but were there, maybe there were tidbits that you could take out of that and still apply in the project work. Was it, in particular, also for what you tried, was there anything that was particularly difficult? And I also mentioned homework was trying to identify a bottleneck in your workflows. So how did that go in what you tried last
week? We have to be honest that we literally just get our project board set up properly in Topleft yesterday. So I thought, that's probably a great effort to make it to today's session. At least we can look at things that we're supposed to look at it. But yeah, so that's where we're at right now. Looking forward to see what we can learn from today.
Got it. Okay, well, good that you got access now. Even without being able to visualize your work on a Kanban board, did you think all about the concept of a bottleneck and trying to find what could be like one part of your system of work, part of your workflow? What's the one spot that's limiting our speed there? Do you do any thinking about that?
No?
I didn't see it yesterday until right now. So my biggest thing is around the scheduling of tickets. That's what I'm hoping we can get here.
Yeah.
I think our bottleneck is probably resourcing, right? That the the resource we have is limited. It could be pulled apart from multiple different angles. It's internal stuff they have to do. Just people want help on support desk. People got sick. People go on holidays, any other things, right? So the biggest bottleneck is probably, as you mentioned last week, is the senior engineers that everybody want to help.
Yeah.
So I guess as Darren said, our hope is that out of today's session we'll be able to, I guess, visualize that resourcing and be able to schedule those resources much easier than, I guess, from ConnectWise Manage.
Yeah.
You have to go and click into assign what, and it doesn't really give you the visuals. How busy or how he's working on the week. The challenge we have is, we have certain hours available for engineer, and then you schedule that against that, and then how did you know whether he actually did
Yes.
what you asked him to do, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. I'm definitely have some stuff that I can show you in that regard. So I'll have some material that we'll go through some a little bit of kind of in theory, theory about how does this work in Agile. What are some of the key foundation bits to understand there, and then I do have a couple of things that I will show you, which I think will be useful for you there in managing that kind of thing. I'll show you that before we finish. All right, screen share. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about, first of all, your project portfolio. So considering all of the projects that are going there, first of all, in order to do this effectively, you got to know what are all the projects that you're doing. So in theory, it's easy to know what are the projects that you're working on. They come from sales team, or whatever the process is in your company. The projects come from somewhere, but it's maybe not quite as simple as you might think. You want to consider, in terms of your project team, you do want to consider more than just what comes through your sales process. Basically, it's what is a project? First of all, it's something that you as the MSP are driving versus more reactive stuff out of a help desk. And when a project, you're the ones responsible not just for the technology, and making sure that you're developing a good IT solution for your client's problems, but that you're also delivering it in a way that, deliver it successfully, meeting their expectations. So that is an important part of the what makes something a project. But you cannot just consider what's coming in from the clients. You also want to consider any internal work, because at any size MSP, you're always kind of a lot of the value that you bring as an MSP is some of your practices and systems and whatnot that you use to provide value to your customers. Whether it's like an integrated backup system, or like dark web monitoring. There's always like a variety of things that you consider your services that you provide, and so you always have internal projects as well. And in general, you don't have a separate team that only works on that stuff. No, you probably have your senior engineers working on both stuff for your clients, but also internal stuff as well. So definitely you need to be including any of your internal projects, include them in your portfolio, because they are going to be delayed. Well, it's not really that they're delaying your other work. Like that is, first class work that they need to do. So it all needs to be considered. Now, a couple of tips for how you display this on a Kanban board in Topleft. Considering the columns that you have, especially when you're starting out, you can really use whatever you currently have for project statuses. Most MSPs, when they look at like the possible ticket statuses, they might have 15 or 20 different statuses for tickets. For projects, it tends to be simpler. Like maybe you got 5 or 6 different statuses. And when you have that many statuses, sometimes you can just make one column for each one. Just make sure you get them in the right order so that it's starting from left to right. on the board, so you see them progressing from left to right. But sometimes you can just keep it really simple. And that's a good way to start. Just always do the simplest thing that can work. As far as the swim lanes go, the horizontal lanes where you might group the projects, some of the time you can actually get by without having any swim lanes. So I would say up to maybe 20 projects or so, you can typically just not have any swim lane. You can just see them all on one board, no problem. However, when you get to more than 20 as a general rule, then it starts to get kind of overwhelming. You're looking at it and like, wow, it is kind of hard to understand this. So then at that point, I would say use a swim lane. Now you could probably have a lot more than 20. So you would want to use a swim lane. A good first choice is a project manager as a swim lane that splits it out so you can see who is managing which projects and who's managing more projects than other people. Swim lane makes that very clear. Uh, for an MSP, some smaller MSPs, they really only have one project manager. So in that case, a project manager swim lane isn't really useful. You just end up with all of your projects in one swim lane. So in that case, maybe use a company swim lane or something like that. That would be a good second choice. So those are some tips for setting out a project portfolio board. One thing I want to mention here about project management in an agile view is something that might be new. If you're new to any, haven't read much about agile project management before, is that we want to consider the potential of having certain cycles. So if you were to do what's called Scrum, Scrum is a particular agile methodology. There's lots of books about it. It calls for certain processes. One of the things that they call for in Scrum specifically is a period of time. So you're always working in cycles. It calls it a sprint. Okay, a sprint is a period of time that you choose as a team. Different companies or different teams might have a different sprint length. 1 week or 2 weeks is the most common. So you split your time into periods of 1 week or 2 weeks, or what you might choose. And within that, you, at the beginning of the sprint, you select the tickets that you want to get done for that team for that sprint, whether it's a week or 2 weeks or whatever. That's supposed to stay fixed during that period, during that sprint. You're not supposed to be removing certain tickets from that or adding new ones. That the benefit is that it gives your engineers some stability and predictability to know, okay, these are the expectations for this sprint. This is our goals that we're trying to get through, and it's not going to change during the sprint. Like I can't say anything about what's going to happen next sprint, but we're not in that sprint yet. Doesn't matter. But at least for the sprint that we're working on now, we got some predictability, and I can just know what I need, what are the expectations, and I can do that. So that's what you get if you're doing a Scrum method. Kanban is a different agile methodology. Kanban is kind of a little bit more open. Like it doesn't, in terms of the practices that are mandated, like it doesn't call for as specific things to do as Scrum does. And Kanban doesn't call for a particular cycle length in terms of a sprint. It's you're just kind of working continually. So you might say that there's not a cycle in Kanban. That would be true because you're just kind of working continually. Well, you would choose that if you want more flexibility. The idea being that it's totally okay to just be constantly reordering the list of tickets that are to be done next. You still don't want to interrupt engineers when they're already working on a ticket. Okay, like the stuff that you've started, you want to finish. If you don't do that, then you're increasing your work in progress, right? And we've talked about how you don't want to be, you want to limit your work in progress. So anything that's already started by an engineer, no, manager definitely needs to let them finish unless some sort of extraordinary situation where there's some emergency work or whatever. Last week we talked about how that should be rare. So, but the stuff that's coming up, next tickets to do, that's totally flexible. And if if every time an engineer goes back to find what's the next ticket that I'm supposed to work on in my list, if every time they go back there's a different ticket at the top, then that's okay. I mean, in practice, you're not going to actually get that happening, but that would be, it's within the realm of possibility. In Kanban terms, that's okay. There's flexibility there. And I'll talk a little bit more about this cycle stuff in the as we talk about some of the other uh, agile project management practices here. So any questions about Scrum versus Kanban? Anybody heard of Scrum before? Is that brand new, or have you at least heard of it before?
I've heard of it, not used it though.
Yeah. I in a prior position, I worked in a Scrum team, and I think our sprints were 2 weeks, if I remember right. And all the stuff that I've done more recently is Kanban. So I'll just say, like, my personal preference and which is based on what we need as a team right now, is Kanban. And I do like the flexibility. However, if what you need in your team is more predictability, then Scrum would definitely be a good practice to look at. And by the way, like, there really are lots of books, and other training courses and whatnot that really go into the details of Scrum. Like, I'm absolutely just barely scratching the surface. So if that sounds interesting to you, then I definitely would advise to get one of those books, get one of those training courses, and yeah, jump in and get some more experience with that. Okay, so we had talked about identifying projects. Now, in terms of how you would show that on a Kanban board, this is just kind of an example. Like, maybe even it's not even our software. You don't actually need Topleft Kanban software to do all these practices. Some companies, some teams have gotten a lot of success out of just writing writing work on sticky notes and sticking one on the wall. Now, obviously, you can't really do that at scale, but these will be kind of my examples here. So, if you were to do that, you would just have a section, horizontal section here for the projects that you're working on. Maybe you got a firewall replacement, maybe you got an email migration for certain companies. So you just make sure there's a horizontal section there in top left. That would be a swim lane for each project. And that is where you begin to identify the projects that you're working on. The next stage after you identify the projects is to start breaking down the work that's involved in those projects. So, you're going to make tickets for that project work in your ConnectWise or your Autotask. I mean, and you're probably like, you know what? This is super obvious. Like, we know this already, but it's not always as easy as it seems. I actually just in the last couple of weeks here, I had a call with an MSP, and they were just wondering how to get started with this. Like, they wanted to know, how do we get started with project management? And they had been making uh, like a single ticket for their projects. They had tickets that had 150 hours on them, which is not appropriate for a single ticket when you're trying to manage your project. And so we had to start at a very basic level. So it's not always as simple as it sounds. If you feel like you got down, you're capable at the breaking down work task of project management. Well, then that's a good job, because not everybody is. So um, you might want to know, how much work should you break down in your project? Well, one thing is that you want to consider the length of your cycle, whether it's Kanban or Agile, and what's the length of your sprint. If you're using Scrum and you've got sprints, you need to be able to see what needs to be started in the next sprint, okay, and do planning for that milestone. So if say you've split out your project into certain milestones, key deliverables, and okay, well, we will have capacity to start this milestone of this project within the next sprint. Well, then you need to take the time to break down that milestone into its tickets, so that you're ready to start that at the beginning of the next sprint. If you're doing Kanban, then when you see, okay, we're getting ready to start that milestone, okay, now it's time to break that work down. I would always say, always do it for a whole milestone at a time, because then you can kind of just think cohesively about what needs to be done as part of that milestone, so that you don't forget it. Because forgetting or not recognizing certain tasks that need to be done for a deliverable is the biggest way to just totally bust your project budget So we definitely want to be in the mindset of thinking about a whole milestone so that we can think about all the elements that are necessary for that, so we don't get surprised later. So that's why I would say do a whole milestone at a time. And I would advise against planning out the full details of a whole big project all at once, because that's not very agile. Um, you if you do that, there are more ways that you might have to go back. As you progress through the project, you get towards the end. Well, there's more chances that you're going to get to the end of the project, but you're gonna have to replan those because you learned things through the project that's going to educate your planning for what's still to come. Or maybe you're going to have to cut down the scope of that because you already went over budget and you got it, but you still got to bring the project as a whole under control. So you got to cut down the scope on certain things, and all of the planning that you did prior to that is now just wasted because now you're coming back to redo it. So try to minimize as much as possible the amount of planning that goes into later stages of the project. If you can. Now, I know that in terms of selling the project, the customer kind of expects a certain. Um, you're going to set a budget, you're going to sell a project. So there is going to be some work that needs to be done. I would say, however, especially for uh, projects that are more uncertain, or they're just kind of totally custom one-off projects, it's preferable to split that into multiple small projects. So in fact, if you could consider, whereas previously maybe if you had a big project, it had a bunch of milestones, and you would typically do all the planning for all the milestones at the beginning, it's preferable to split that into like one project per milestone. So that you can just avoid selling that or committing to a certain budget on those projects until you get closer to actually delivering them. And that allows you to integrate all the learning that you're doing throughout those projects for those one-off projects. Like a lot of this doesn't really apply for projects that you do over and over, which should mention, like you should do a lot of those. The more projects that you can do over and over, like if you've got a standard firewall replacement project, well, that's great. Okay, that is a good way to be really profitable on those projects when you can get good at that. And so in that sort of thing, where basically your project is more of a product because you're doing the same thing over and over, then this doesn't really apply. You should definitely, as you become experts on that type of project, you should put it out in a lot of detail. But then it's not uncertain. So there is kind of a difference in how you should break down work for kind of uncertain one-off projects versus common projects that you do over and over. Now, how do you set what's the appropriate size of a ticket? We get questions like this over and over. What is an appropriate size? Because like I mentioned, I talked to some people who are putting 150 hours on a ticket. I mean, and that's pretty clearly outrageous. We definitely don't want that. But what is a good size of a ticket? So we definitely have some recommendations about that. So, like, why is this important? Well, like, why is it important to break down a ticket so it's not 150 hours on a single ticket? Well, it's on a huge ticket, it's just impossible to get any shared visibility into the project progress of the whole project. If there's a giant ticket, nobody can look at that ticket and know where it is, except maybe the engineer. If there's one engineer working on that, then hopefully they know where they're at. But if they ever leave it for a week or two, they are gonna forget, and the customer can't see it, and the project manager can't see it. Very, very inefficient because you're going to have to ask every time you want to know it's an update, where that project actually is. You're going to have to ask. So it's very ineffective in that regard. What we really need is a way for everybody on a project to see exactly what's been done on that project, and what's still to come, and what's in progress now, and whatnot. So that's why we split tickets into smaller ones. Um, the ideal ticket is something that is kind of a single element of value for the client. That's a little bit fuzzy. It kind of There's an element of kind of personal opinion and about how to do that. Another way to think of it is also something that can be done by a single engineer in a single session. So if an engineer sit down for the afternoon, the engineer is thinking, Okay, I can do this much work. I can get this bit of work done by the end of the day. That could also be a good size for a single ticket. Um, as an example, like let's suppose that you're doing a firewall migration project. Um, one ticket could be to do the configuration of that firewall in your office before you deploy it. Okay, so that you know when you take it on site is ready to deploy. It wouldn't be the entire firewall migration in a single ticket. Now, so that one is kind of fuzzy in terms of our ideal ticket, like a single element of value to the client. You could say, well, the client doesn't really get value out of that alone, right? Does the client really care if the firewall is configured if it's not also deployed into their site and actually functioning? Yeah, maybe not. So maybe on that consideration, it's not that great. But it could be we got to split it up somehow, right? We don't want to end up with these huge tickets. And configuring that firewall is something that can be done by a single engineer in a single session before they get onto some other work. So in that regard, it's a decent ticket. What I mean is it's not an exact science. There's a few things to consider, like the visibility, and those are just some ideas about how to set a size of a good ticket. A couple of problems here that you might encounter is if the engineer actually has to sit down and do some work, and then they go off and do something else, and then tomorrow they come back to that ticket to continue it, and then the day after they come back to that ticket to continue it. Okay, if that's happening on a ticket, that's probably too big of a ticket. That it would be good to think about how that sort of ticket could be split up into different elements where, when an engineer comes down to do some work, he doesn't get interrupted, he can finish a whole section of work. That would be a good ticket. So maybe that ticket needs to be split up. Another problem I've seen is that tickets are too small. So if you know that tickets are too small, if an engineer sits down in the morning and they get through like 5 different tickets all in a row, and then they sit back and they're like, does anybody really care which ticket I put my time against? Because I worked on 5 different tickets, but I don't think anybody's going to care which one I put my time against. Or if I like split it up into exactly what I worked on when. If that happens, that's too small of a ticket. With that, you should probably combine those into a single ticket and maybe use a checklist functionality in your PSA to define those what was 5 tickets, define those as 5 checklist items on that sort of ticket. Now that problem is a lot less common than people having too big tickets. Definitely see people with tickets that are too big more than too small, but definitely I have also heard of people making tickets that are too small. I've definitely done it myself as well. Try to split things up into be too detailed and not gotten any value out of that. We do have a pretty strong recommendation though that any single ticket should never be more than 2 days of work. So 15, 16 hours or so. If you um, yeah, if you're planning out your work and you set up a ticket, and I mean you'll put a budget on it. I'll talk about that in a moment. When you put your budget on it and you're like, wow, this is like actually probably a 30-hour ticket. No, split that up into something smaller, at least 2 other tickets to get that down to a reasonable size. Okay, I just want to talk quickly about when you're doing this work, what fields in your PSA do you actually use? Like, does Agile call for a lot of details? Do you have to use everyone? Now, let me talk about that a little bit. Okay, so the fields that you're going to use when you're setting up your project tickets are you're going to use a summary and title. Okay, obviously you need that. You're going to need the description field to set out the scope. You're going to need the list of tasks, maybe possibly using the checklist function. You're going to use a due date, but only if there's a constraint imposed from outside. Okay, so some people have sometimes asked, hey, or told me that they're using like all of their tickets have a due date, but they always have to update them when inevitably things don't go according to plan, and then all of your tickets are overdue, and then they just have to go and update all of them. Well, okay, that's not really a due date. Okay, you're using the due date to as a way to manage the work, to kind of try to estimate when that ticket's going to be done, but it's not a due date, right? A due date is for something if there's um, it's as I say, they're a constraint imposed from outside. So it would be like, you know,
Deadline.
a deadline. Like it could be, it could be that, you know, you set the deadline when you offered to do this project in a contract. Okay, that could be a deadline. It could be that there's a regulatory change that comes to effect on a certain date. It could be that it has to do with an event that's happening at a conference, or like our MSP. We do a lot of work for schools, right? So there's certain things that have to be done in the school break period. Because once school starts, you can't do that work anymore. So that would be a good reason to use the due date. Then that does help you identify that work that needs to be done. You know, by a certain date. Otherwise, you get really embarrassed. If you can just reset that, push back that due date, then it's probably not a real due date. There's other stuff that you might use, you know, whether you're ConnectWise or AutoTask, you know, like type, subtype item, and dependencies between the tickets. Only bother with setting that sort of stuff if you're actually going to use that stuff, right? If you actually do some reporting on like type, subtype, and item, then go ahead and use that. But if you don't, if nobody cares, like nobody ever even looks at that later, don't bother, right? It's just kind of wasted work to just worry about that stuff if nobody's actually going to get some value out of that. Okay. Now there are some fields that you shouldn't set. So one would be priority. Basically, at this stage of the work, priority should always be just kind of your normal average priority. We don't use priority too much in project work. That's more of a help desk thing. The start date and the duration, don't set those, because that, when you set a start date, you're basically saying, I need an engineer to start on this work on a certain date, but you don't know if an engineer is actually going to be available to do that. So that's an example of pushing work to an engineer. Remember, maybe you remember, I think from the first session, we talked about like push versus pull. We don't, in Agile, we don't push work to people and say, engineer must start work on a certain day. No, the engineer will pull the work to themselves when they have capacity, so that we don't set the start date and we don't set the duration. That's also a form of like pushing it to somebody. And we don't set we don't assign it like at this step. We don't assign it. We will assign it probably, but that comes later. So at this this particular stage of the work, we don't need to assign it. Okay, I said I was going to talk a little bit more about the budget. Okay, so you can enter a budget or story points. So I mentioned, you know, if you're doing your budgeting in hours and you come out with more than 15 or 16 hours, cut it down to 2 tickets or more. The reason that we do this, we set the budget or story points. I'll explain that if you haven't heard about that. Is because it helps us to estimate capacity and then set the priority of that. Because I think you mentioned, we need to know how much work are we going to be able to do this week, or how many tickets is it realistic for us to get through this week. Okay, so you need some sort of budget to begin to estimate that. Also to set the priority, because sometimes you're happy to just get through a bunch of small, simple tickets before you start on the more on the bigger ones, especially if the smaller tickets provide some real value to the user. Then yeah, go ahead and get the small tickets done first. And you have to put in the budget so that you know which ones are the small tickets. So that's a couple of reasons that we do that. A note on story points. So if you've heard of Scrum, you might have heard of story points. Those kind of go hand in hand. Other times they call them complexity points. That is a different way of estimating work. It's not done in hours. It's basically just a unitless number. Okay, you just I mean, and there's other ways to do it as well. Like sometimes you don't even use a number. Some people have done things like t-shirt sizes, you know, small, medium, large, extra large, or whatever. Like the idea is just to kind of get a general idea of how complex this work is. Story points would just be an integer. Like some people have used Fibonacci sequence. Okay, like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. The important point about that is that it's not an estimate in hours. You're estimating it on terms of like what's the complexity of that work, what's the whole scope of that work compared to other work that we've already done. The interesting point there is that a variety of different engineers, like different skill levels of engineers, should be able to kind of agree on the story points or the complexity points compared to the hours, right? If you're doing it in hours, a senior engineer is inevitably going to estimate something as a smaller number of hours than a junior engineer. So in that case, it depends on who's actually doing the work. But that's not the case with story points. So that's one of the reasons, that's one of the advantages, is that when you're doing story points, it doesn't really matter who actually does that work, because you're not looking at the worker, you're looking at the nature of the work itself. Also, if some teams do this, is that they kind of get together in a meeting and they all try to estimate the complexity points of a ticket. And if there's disagreement there, somebody estimates it as a 5 and someone else estimates it as a 13. Well, that can mean that the scope of that ticket is not actually clear, because somebody thinks it's simple like a 5, and someone else thinks it's complex like a 13. So that would call out some discussion, like figure out, okay, why the different estimates there? Maybe like something's not clear about that, or maybe whoever, could be that whoever is estimating it as a 13 is more experienced, and they know, there's actually a lot involved in that. Or maybe the person who thinks that it's a 5 is like, well, no, we just did almost that exact same sort of work over here like 2 weeks ago. And so it's actually really simple because we just did that. Anyway, it brings out the conversation so that you can be on the same page about that work. So, that again, that's just scratching the surface of this. I also, have heard people who are like, we don't want to do that at all. Like they don't like to do that. So there's pros and cons to that. I'm not saying, for sure, I'm not saying everybody should be doing it in story points. Just that that's one of the options that has really benefited some teams. um, the work that you should estimate is the work that needs to be done soon, right? So if you are doing Scrum, then you need to estimate one future sprint's worth, 1 or 2 weeks or whatever. If you're doing Kanban, all you got to estimate is just enough to keep people's queues from getting empty, right? You don't want people to run out of work. So you just need to make sure that that's always, you got your engineers' queues filled up with work so that they don't run out. Okay, so talking about the scope of a ticket. I mean, I mentioned this already. This description or the scope of a ticket must be clear. This is critically important. I mean, it also kind of comes down to, what if you're estimating in story points and you come out with a disagreement? Well, maybe it's because your description was not clear and people are making different assumptions. So this is really important for that to be clear. One way that we well, yeah, because everybody needs the same understanding of it, not just the project manager and the engineer, but the client as well, so that they get the outcome that they expect. Because that's another pretty good way to bust your project budget, is to deliver over some work to the customer and they're like, well, that's good, but that's only 2/3 of what I thought I was getting for my project. And then you have to go back and just kind of eat that and deliver them what they thought they were getting. So definitely want to make sure that this is all clear. One way that we have found here to make sure that this stays clear is to just make it super simple and explicit. We make we call it the done when checklist. And sometimes like when I'm laying out work to do, I literally just write done when, and then I make a checklist of, whatever, however many things. Sometimes it's just one thing if it's a really simple ticket. Maybe I probably wouldn't do more than 10 things. That's even getting to be a lot. But, just a point form list of things that need to be done. And it can be, that can also be like actually using the checklist functionality in the tickets in ConnectWise or Autotask. And, the level of detail of those points can vary, because if you're going to have more senior person doing this work, then maybe you can just write kind of the outcomes. You don't have to lay out all the details of actually how to do this. And maybe if okay, more junior person is probably going to do this work, then maybe you do have to lay it out, not just in the outcomes, but the specific things to do. So you still, how you write this kind of still depends on who might be doing the work. But you know, even for us, if you have your most senior person doing it, and you know you trust them completely, it's still good to set up those set out specific checklist of things that you expect to be done before that work is done, so that everybody's on the same page about that. Hard to emphasize that too much. It's really critical. Okay, so I'll get you a kind of a example of a Kanban board doing some of this work in just a moment, but I just want to talk about the typical project columns again for this. They're very similar to what you would have in a typical service board, but they're not exactly the same. So you know, backlog, ready, waiting, scheduled, in progress, and completed. That's pretty similar to a help desk environment. In fact, it's the same except at the beginning. So as I mentioned, you know, you're not doing the typical triage process. Obviously, the biggest difference there is that in the first column, you know, in service we typically call it new and not backlog, but you know the name itself doesn't really matter. The biggest actual difference here, though, is that in project environment, it's okay for tickets to sit in the backlog for potentially quite some time, sometimes even months. It really depends, because sometimes you do create a ticket or create a project, and especially if it comes from a project template, because it's the sort of project you do over and over, then you're going to get all of the tickets for that project all at once. But you're not going to actually do all those tickets all at once. So if some of them sit in the backlog column for months, that's okay. And now, obviously, that doesn't work at all in the service environment. So that's one big difference. So the backlog you use as a kind of a holding place for tickets that you don't expect to do immediately. Kind of the next step there is for the project manager to recognize, okay, we're getting on this project, we're getting to the stage where some of these tickets that are in the backlog are getting ready to be done fairly soon. So I'm going to move them over into the ready column, and I'm going to start doing my work on those, which it would be, you know, making sure that they got a good scope and setting a budget on them if that's not already done, and then getting them assigned to somebody, which I'll talk about shortly. Okay, so specifically on a Kanban board, that would look kind of like this. When you're breaking down work, you'd have one card for each ticket or task, and then you do rank them. Okay, that's part of this work too, just the same as you would do in a service environment where you rank the tickets so that the engineers know which is the most important tickets to do first. Well, we still rank them here in the backlog so that you know kind of what's the order, roughly speaking, that we're gonna do those tickets in. So you know, if it's just a wall, you know, you just put them in an order. In Topleft, you're dragging them up and down in the columns for all the different tickets that you have. Then, as you take those tickets over into Ready, then or here now we have a ready column, and some of those tickets, the project manager, you're going to recognize that we need to start doing those fairly soon, so you're going to pull them over into ready, and then you're going to put a budget on them. So you might write on, you know, again, if you're just doing sticky notes on the wall, then you might write on the ticket the number of hours or story points or whatever it is that you're using, put that on there so that you've got a budget, and make sure that they're ranked in the ready column as well, from top to bottom, to make sure that they are ranked appropriately. The next step after that is to assign the work to an engineer. That's kind of the trigger that makes that ticket actually get done. Now, one of the considerations there is that you want to, as much as you can, you want to minimize the constraints, minimize your constraints for who you can assign that work to. So that would be like thinking like which engineers are familiar with which customers. Like ideally, you want all of your engineers to be familiar with all of your projects and all of your customers, so that you can assign any work to anybody. Now, I know that is hard to achieve, and not a lot of MSPs are actually able to do that. Typically, you would have certain engineers that are more familiar with certain projects or more familiar with certain customers. But the more that you can, you know, document things and you know, cross train within your team, the more that you have flexibility to assign any engineer to any project. And that's a good benefit. That's going to help your projects run a lot more smoothly. Especially when things don't go according to plan, because if you got one engineer you were planning to have doing a certain ticket, and all of a sudden they become unavailable, well, then other engineers can just pick up that work without too much trouble, and that project keeps moving forward. In terms of considerations for which tickets you actually want to assign, well, you want to be looking at things like, do they have an approaching due date? Well, if the due date is approaching, well, that would be a priority to get that assigned to somebody. You also want to be thinking about the milestone as a whole. Like, do we need to be delivering a whole milestone soon? And does this ticket block any other work within that milestone? Well, if so, then definitely that's one that you want to get assigned earlier rather than later. You're also just thinking about the whole project portfolio as well. Which projects are we running right now? Which are the big projects that we need to be doing a lot on because it's a major project? Even like which customers are particularly important to you right now? And so those are some of the considerations about which tickets you want to get assigned and when. Now, by the way, the the ass- uh, the task of assigning tickets to an engineer, um, we, everything I mentioned last week about your different dispatch methods, like in the team queue or the individual technician queue, all of that same stuff applies. So, kind of an ideal dispatch method would be to not even actually dispatch them, just to have a single queue of tickets where project manager orders the tickets. It could be a couple tickets from one project, a couple tickets from another project. Basically, they just order those tickets one by one in terms of their importance to the team as a whole. And then you don't even assign them. Engineers just take from the top whenever they're ready for new work. That's kind of the ideal way to do it. I talked about that last week in the service stuff, and that still applies here. That is possible. Or maybe you assign it to a certain tier, even if you have like multiple tiers within your project engineer team. You could assign them to different tiers within which members of those tiers take those tickets. Now, I know this happens less frequently in project environment because it's more common for particular engineers to be running particular projects, but it is possible and it's something to consider doing. So, in order to manage this on a Kanban board, you would switch out the swim lane. So notice up until this point we have had the swim lanes have been the project swim lanes. Now we switch them around and we do the member swim lanes. So here we have a swim lane for our individual members. So we got swim lane for one staff here and for the next staff here, and that would go down for all of the members of your team. And within that, then you can, when you assign those tickets, then they appear in their swim lane, and within that you can rank them. So we got your highest priority ticket here, second priority, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. So that is what you're going to be looking at this stage of the work, and that's why in top left, our recommendations are to have a board that's showing your tickets in the project swim lane, and on another board that's showing them by the member swim lane. That's one of our key recommendations for project work, is to have those two types of boards. And this is why, so that in one mode, you're looking at the projects themselves, getting those ready to go. Then when you actually want to get those tickets assigned to the members to actually do that work, then you look at it in this mode so that you can see uh, who's assigned to what work, see who has maybe a shorter queue of work so that they're ready to take on more things, who has too much work already and you really ought not to assign anything new to them, and whatnot. And so at this stage, the engineers take over. They work from their queue. Project manager still needs to monitor the work, but that is made simpler by having the work on a top left board. And just like in the service world I mentioned last week, we like to manage by exception. So some of those exceptions would be looking at the due date. So if it's a ticket that does have a due date, look at it versus a progress. If it's coming up in the next few days and the ticket's not started yet, well, maybe you need to rank that to the top of the column so that it does get done soon. you want to be monitoring for the hours logged versus a budget. So if you get too many hours logged on that ticket and it's eating up the budget, that you know about it early so you can make changes early if that's necessary. We want to look at the long time in the column. Remember, as I said last week, different columns have different thresholds for how long is too long. But that's really a key one, especially for the in progress column. Our recommendation generally is to not be in there more than 2 days. Once a ticket's been in progress for 2 days or more, that's considered a problem. You definitely, as a project manager, you want to be involved in that and figure out why that has stalled. A long time with a time entry or note and bottlenecks and so on. So really, that's just a lot of the similar. Oh, and also anything that's escalated from an engineer, definitely you want to be monitoring for that. Substantially the same as for service delivery. As are the resolutions that you might want to do there. So if you need to reassign a ticket, you can move it to a new engineer. By the way, in Topleft, when you're looking at it with a member swim lane board, you can actually just drag a ticket from one swim lane to the next, and that will reassign that work in ConnectWise or Autotask. So it makes that job real easy. Sometimes you need to suspend new assignments for an engineer. If a particular engineer has a large work in progress, then you probably don't want to assign them new work. You want to give them a chance to work that down. You can also split up the tickets. If a ticket was too big, or again, if you finished the main part of the work and it turns out there's just a little bit of work that needs to be done, but there's some reason that we can't get to it right now, then go ahead and take that work that's not done, take that into its own new ticket, and then you can just mark that big ticket as complete. That's always good, satisfying to do. Sometimes also you just cancel the work. If it's out of date, there's no reason for it, we took too long and the business case is gone, or the client won't answer your questions, then sometimes you just cancel it. And as I mentioned last week, again, a manager's role in resolving some of those problems is made a lot easier by identifying and fixing those problems within the daily meeting. So another good reason to have a huddle, because you can identify those problems and just discuss them right away. Don't have to worry about it the rest of the day. And also the engineers who are looking at the Topleft boards can see some of those problems on their own and fix them on their own. So that makes your job a lot easier. Okay, so now I want to get into some tips and tricks that you can use in Topleft for project management. And some of this stuff specifically has to do with scheduling stuff out and seeing what is our actual capability and when can I expect to get certain work done. Now, first of all, I frequently see folks with, they have a project. It's got lots of tickets, and within that project is a ticket called like project management, or maybe it's like meetings or some. It's just kind of a catch-all that it's not a ticket that has any real scope, or it's not for actually accomplishing the goals of the project. It's just there to catch all some time for planning or meetings or whatever. A lot of people do this. We do it too. But sometimes I see them put it in the in progress status. That's no good, because then every time you look at the in progress status, you're going to see this project management ticket along with some of the other tickets. If it's a firewall migration, it has the actual like engineering for the firewall migration there. That's the real tickets with the real scope. It's going to be done. Whereas this project management ticket is never going to be done until the project's over. And so it's just a distraction there when you're looking at that with all of that other those other real tickets. So I want you to not be distracted. That means that we need a dedicated place for that project management ticket. What we recommend is that you make a status in your PSA called ongoing, and also a column on your board called ongoing, and you just put those tickets over there. Or it could be that maybe you don't even want to have those on the Kanban board, although I do like to see them on the Kanban board, then I can easily put time against them. But that's really up to you whether you actually show them there. But anyway, put them in their own dedicated place in an ongoing or some other name that reflects the same thing. That just keeps your board focused. You don't get distracted with those tickets. Okay, now here is a idea about how to do planning, and thinking in terms of when can we commit to starting a new project, or how much work can we actually get done this week with the staff that we have. So here, one pattern that some people have used with good success is the Scrum board. Yeah, that's kind of like combining Scrum and Kanban. Is the combining there's like obviously we're using a Kanban board for this, but we are also using the element of the sprints from Scrum. So we call it Scrumban. This is an example of the columns that you would have on a board like that. So there's some columns here that have some orientation towards time. So it's not actually a dedicated feature in Topleft, but it's a way to use the existing features to accomplish some of this planning that you need to do. So you'd have a column called backlog. Okay, then instead of a ticket called a column called ready, you'd have some time-oriented columns called this. Okay, tickets for 2 weeks. So that would mean like we can do it 2 weeks away. A column for next week, and then a column for this week, and then finally we have in progress and complete. And you might have some other ones as well, like scheduled and waiting and whatever, but this is just simplified here. So this obviously, to make a lot of use of this, you're going to have to set decent budgets on your tickets, even if they're just ballpark. And then there's on the Topleft boards, you can set up a feature, the hours, forget what it's called actually. I think it's called the hours sum feature in the metrics section when you're configuring the board. That turns on a count like this. So if say if there's 10 tickets in a certain column, then they might add up to 48 hours on their budget hours. Okay, so then within the this week column, it would say 48 hours with however many tickets are in that column. And it would do that per each swim lane, actually. So the normal way to do this would be to use the member swim lane board. So each member would have their own swim lane with their own this week column. And so you might see that some technician has 48 hours in their this week column. And that's going to be way too much. You might see that somebody else has only 28 hours in their this week column. Then you could say, oh, if there's any tickets that this other person can do in this engineer's column where it's 48 hours, well, I should move those to this other person who only has 28 hours. Okay, and you can kind of even that out so that you can be sure, okay, this is a more realistic goal for this week. Okay, then you'd also say, okay, next week for this person, well, I only have 24 hours. Oh, okay. Well, another way to fix, well, I can have more than 24 hours in the expectation to do for next week. So actually, maybe if I can't move any tickets off to some other engineer from the this week column, well, then I could at least move some of them back from this week to next week. You just drag them back one column, and then it will update these summaries here, and then you can see, oh, based on the number of not just the number of tickets, but the actual budgets on those tickets that are within those columns, I can see, okay, am I scheduling this out in kind of a reasonable way? So here's the benefit. Like traditionally, this has been done with the calendar, right? So you have to choose the person to do a ticket, and then you've got to actually put it into the calendar it's got to have a certain be on the right day. Like there's got to be a free block of the right size within that day, and you got to put it in there. And then if they don't get to that work at the right day at the right time, then you just got to reschedule it. That's the traditional way, and it's just a lot of work and it requires a lot of changes. So it's a lot of waste because sometimes you're scheduling things 2 or 3 or 4 times, even more sometimes. Whereas with Kanban and this kind of Scrumban technique, instead of we still get the idea of, okay, is our plan realistic? We've got not too many hours, not too few hours for each individual, or you could do it for the team as a whole. That would work as well. But is our plan realistic? And given that it's realistic, if I'm concerned about a particular ticket, where is it? Is it in this week? Is it in next week? Is it 2 weeks out because it's not a really high priority? So they can answer questions like that. But it has the advantage of being a lot more flexible. So if somebody is out for a certain day, you don't actually have to go and change all of those tickets for that day. They're just going to stay in the column there in the Kanban board. They're going to stay in the same order. So it doesn't require any extra work from a project manager or a dispatcher if things don't go according to plan. It just might mean that you have, if someone's out for a day or two unexpectedly, well, you're not gonna get through all of the tickets that you had planned to get through. Okay, so maybe at the end of this week, there's still some tickets left over. Oh well, okay. I mean that's not a big deal. It just means that there's fewer tickets that we can move from next week into this week. So, does that all make sense? Any questions about that?
Probably, I don't know if this is the right place for it, but you're talking about shuffling tickets around between engineers. That's great. But how do you visualize dependencies in this situation? So if this ticket has to be done before that ticket, and we've just got a big lag of tickets up on the board, how do we make sure that we don't try to do something that we can't do?
Good question. So um, there's a couple of ways you might do that. So one is if the project is simple, this is harder if it's actually a really complex project. But sometimes some of the projects are simple enough that you can just keep that in your head, and okay, I know that this ticket needs to be done before this other one, and so I'm gonna keep this other ticket that can't be started yet. I'm just gonna keep it in the backlog until this other ticket has gotten through to in progress and complete. And only when it's fairly well done in progress or complete, only then am I going to drag this ticket out of the backlog into the ready column or into one of these time-based columns here. Okay, so that's one way to do it. And Topleft does offer a way to indicate predecessors on the Kanban board. If you have gone out of your way to set up the predecessors on those tickets in ConnectWise, or Autotask supports it as well, then I think I'm trying to remember how it works here. If the ticket has a predecessor, you can make it display that on the card, and then if you hover over that area on a card, it'll say the ticket number that is the predecessor of that ticket. And if that ticket appears on the board, when you hover over that area on the one card, it highlights the other card for you. So it makes it really easy to identify, okay, where is that ticket predecessor on the board if it has one. So that's how it works on the Kanban board. Also on the Gantt charts, it displays in pretty typical way, like the lines going between them when there's a predecessor. And actually, that was my kind of next point, is that we do Topleft does have Gantt charts now. There's a few different modes of Gantt charts, which is useful for making some estimates about what sort of work you can do and when. So, your project managers, I'm sure I don't have to tell you much about the Gantt chart. This is an example in Topleft of the project's timeline, we call it. So this would be available from a project overview board. There's a little icon that comes up in the main menu. In that case, you click it and you get this board that shows you it shows you the same projects that appear on the Kanban board. It just shows it to you in this Gantt form, and they're all ordered by time. Now you would ConnectWise doesn't support like predecessors between projects, so you wouldn't ever see the predecessor sort of formatting here. But we support also the just typical Gantt charts for a single project where you see all the tickets and the relationships between them if you've set them up in ConnectWise, and so you would see the little lines there that come out from the front or the end of of these cards there to indicate the predecessors. And then if you haven't used this on the in the app, you can drag these bars back and forth, or yeah, if you were to drag the whole bar back and forth, it would change the start and the end dates for that, whether it's a project or whether it's a ticket. You can also drag one end or the other end, and then that would change the duration and the start date or the end date. So it can really help you to get some estimate about like is another way to try to estimate, okay, what are we able to do here? Because maybe we can do a certain number of tickets at once or a certain number of projects at once, and then you can easily drag these around to make sure, okay, that we're not committing to doing 14 projects all at once. No, we gotta wait for some of them to finish before we start other ones. So it's a good way to make that quite clear. I do just want to kind of warn that the Gantt charts are not traditionally part of Agile methods. If you're using the Gantt chart, gonna be doing some planning, and probably you're gonna be making changes. So in that way, it's not agile. Like it is gonna be some waste because you're gonna spend some time setting out some dates you think are realistic. Inevitably, things are gonna change, so you're gonna have to come back and make changes, whether you're looking at the tasks or the project one like this, the projects as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, right? I'm well aware that MSPs need to be able to kind of estimate, okay, what is our capacity? How many projects can we do? When what does that mean if you're, what we're working on now? When are we going to be able to start some new projects? Customers do expect that. So definitely, I'm not saying you should never do this. Just beware though, you are going to be coming back over and over to make changes. So that's kind of some wasted effort there, but just consider it a cost of doing business in order to be able to tell your customers, yeah, we're fairly certain we can start your project on such and
a
such a
lot
date.
of that.
A bit of a flaky internet connection here. Any? Hey, I apologize for that. It looks like it's my internet connection here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me get that back on screen. Okay. So I was just talking about the Gantt charts and how, if you're going to be estimating some dates on the Gantt charts, then you are going to have to come back and redo it some of the time. So that's kind of a waste. But hey, consider it sort of a cost of doing business in that you are you are getting something out of that. You are getting the ability to tell your customers, we believe we can start your project on around this date. So any questions about any of that estimation and capacity planning? Darren, you're muted, I think.
Sorry, I must have double clicked. So on that that project's timeline board, is that a configurable thing? Can we add some columns to that? I'm thinking of in particular, percentage of budget used. So that if we look at it and go, we're 3/4 through the project and we've only used 10% of the budget, there's an issue. Through that timeline. Just a high level view for exceptions that we should look at and go, hang on, our published timeline is wrong, etc.
Yes. Now I didn't catch. Are you asking that in reference to the Gantt chart or the Kanban boards?
To that Gantt chart, I'm just thinking overall when we're looking at the department's health, it can be a way of identifying exceptions.
Yes. So you were referring to the budget hours, and actually that is reflected here. Like in this example, the red ones here are something where they've already had more than 100% of their budget used. And I don't think there's an example on this image, but there would be an indication here on one that hasn't yet reached its budget already. There would be an indication here. The sort of the part of the bar here would be a one color to reflect how much of the budget has been used. So it looks like I don't have a good example of that in this case, but you would see that in your top left.
So would that
go in
mean,
there,
just to clarify what you mean there, so let's say we'll pick security assessment line 38, that one. If you'd used 5% of the budget, the first 5% of that line would be a different color.
correct.
Okay. So if
Yeah.
you got to April and it was still at that, you'd say something's going on here. Okay.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. Any other questions about any of that?
Just with regards to licensing, perhaps, is this readily available in Topleft, or do you need expansion of your current
This
license?
require a manager license, I believe. Yeah.
That's
Oh, it
right.
does?
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. This is one of the reasons for a manager license. And if you need that, I can maybe I'll have our sales guy reach out to you. And making sure that you're all appropriately licensed there. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Okay. On to the next one then. Okay. So just some notes in particular about using Topleft for all this stuff. One is, okay, so you definitely want to have a project portfolio board. So I think that you did go through the concierge onboarding. That's kind of where we take you through actually setting all this stuff up. So I think that you should have these. So a project portfolio board shows you your whole portfolio. You also want to have boards that show you the tickets within those projects with these swim lanes. So you're gonna have a board that has a project swim lane. So that's where you get a good overview of all the tickets that are in all the projects that are ongoing. Engineers can use this too to see their own work. They can just click the My Tickets button on that board, and then they'll just see their whatever they're assigned to. You also want a member swim lane board. So that's what I was referring to as kind of the second board there, where it splits the work up into who's assigned to that work. It's really useful for seeing who's too busy, who's got some overdue tickets, and who's got a long queue of upcoming work and things like that. Also good for reassigning that work. You just drag it from one swim lane to the next. And then the phase swim lane board. That's really useful for looking at it from a single, looking at a single project, looking at the details of a single project. And typically you'd associate that with the project portfolio board to make it really easy to jump into this board. I won't explain the details of doing that, but basically when you're on the project portfolio board, each project card has a little magnifying glass icon on it. When you click that, you'll be taken into another board that shows you just the tickets for that one project that you clicked on. And chances are it's set up with either the phase swim lanes or maybe it could be a member swim lane. And you'll be able to see just the details there. Okay, some other features that you want to use, the error and the warning thresholds and WIP limits. Okay, same as I explained last week for the service stuff. Dependencies, okay, so you'd asked about that. Dependencies are visible on those, on the ConnectWise in the Kanban board. Drag and drop works just the same as it does in on the service boards. You can drag it between the columns to change the ticket statuses, drag them up and down between the member swim lanes to reassign them. There's functions for editing the tickets. You just click on the ticket and it will pull up the editor for you. You can change various fields about that. And yeah, okay, link project board with the ticket. Yeah, this is what I described already. Yeah, so your homework for this week is to begin using Topleft for that backlog and the estimation and the dispatching. Also the resource planning, if you need to do that right away, see if you can set up some of those boards. So basically try it out. Start doing some of these things from the Kanban board and then report back to me. I'd love to hear if anything seems difficult about that, then I would love to know about that. Let me know. And something you don't even need Topleft for this. When you're making new tickets, use those good practices for setting the scope and size of those tickets, making sure you have the right number of tickets. They're not too big, they're not too small. So use some of those tips for making new tickets in new projects as you go on this week. And yeah, and what I mentioned about the bottlenecks last week, that doesn't apply just to service, it applies to your project environment as well. So Lynn, you had said you perceive that what I said, especially about the senior engineers, you might be affected by that. Well, do some more thinking about that, see if that's true. Another thing that you could do actually is make sure that you've got the right Kanban boards to see if you can actually represent that backlog visually. Okay, so you've got a hunch that is your senior engineers who are a backlog for you. Well, look at probably the member swim lane board for your project team and see if that is in fact true as demonstrated by the Kanban board. Like, is it your senior engineers who have the most tickets and the most overdue tickets? If that's the case, as reflected on the Kanban board, then yeah, you're probably right. It's your senior engineers who are your project bottleneck. So Kanban board can help you prove that or disprove that theory. Although I should mention, That depends on you having good, accurate data. So sometimes when people start to use Topleft, sometimes the very first thing that they see before they can even get into any of these other techniques, the very first thing that they see is that their data is all garbage, right? You got tickets that are in the wrong status. You got tickets that have been closed. Like honestly, they've been closed for months, but actually the ticket is still open in ConnectWise, right? So sometimes you need to go in there and correct some of that data as the very first thing. The good news is that's pretty easy to do in Topleft. You just drag the ticket to complete it, or make a time entry and close it off, or drag it back to waiting instead of in progress, or whatever. So, if you take the time to go through that, Topleft is a very fast way to fix that so that your data is accurate. So, in the next session, we are going to be talking about the engineer's workflow. We really have talked about a lot of other things in a lot of detail, and we haven't even gotten to any detail about how the engineers work out of this. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what we call the general versus the specialized boards. Everything that I've shown you so far is just general boards. We haven't talked, basically boards that can work for anybody at any MSP. Like, even there's really some, even the service and the project boards were mostly the same. So those are general boards. I want to tell you about specialized boards because those can really give you very good visibility into your work and how your work is progressing. And then we'll talk also about some metrics and measurements that you can make with Kanban boards to be a bit more objective about how efficiently you're working and how many problem tickets you have, and to learn over time how you're improving. So we have some ways that we can help with that as well. So we'll talk about that. And that wraps us up for today. So before I let you go, any questions at all?
Matt, just a quick question. Obviously, I know you shared with us the day one, day two. That's from probably a private YouTube channel that you guys have. Just wondering how long, like, obviously we have members have missed a couple of the sessions with their own leaves and etc. And also would like to be able to share those with obviously other parts of business within first focus as well. So I guess, are we allowed to do that? How long are you gonna keep those videos on your YouTube channels, or do we just give them a link, or you can share us the clip of that video?
Yes, you are more than welcome to share that. I would love for you to share that with them. That is the purpose that we do that. And I don't think we have um, any plans to remove that. Usually we just leave stuff up on the
Okay.
YouTube channel. So yeah, I think that'd be fine for you to just like you don't need to go and try to
I
save a
just give them the
copy
link.
yourself. Yeah, just give them the link and they're good to go.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, please do share that. Yeah. Well, anything else I can answer for you?
Whether you guys can give some discount on licensing, because obviously we're gonna start to use them.
Can
Well, I'll
the
mention
manager
it.
license, Matt, be applied temporarily because we don't have the manager license yet? And
Yeah.
I've playing around there. The Gantt chart, for example, you need the manager license. So it seems
Yes.
like quite a few of the features were there. So is there something to be done as a temporary, like a trial upgrade for staff, or do we have to actually go and buy it for people to try it out?
Good question. We have given trial licenses in the past, so I will bring that up with our customer success fellow and the salesman, and they'll be in touch to see if we can work something out for you.
Perfect. Looks like it's just first
All
focus
right.
on the training now, so we can
I know,
concentrate
that's
on
great.
projects.
Yeah. Bring any questions about that. Like, I'm happy to take as much time as you want in the next session to answer questions about projects, even if that's not what the session's about. I'm happy to answer those questions next time too. So take your week to think about it, and especially about the the planning bit, which was your question at the beginning. Because I definitely want you to be comfortable with that and to be able to confidently say, yeah, I understand what the capacities are here and some of the things, and I've got some ideas about how to go forward with that. Good stuff. Yeah. So I look forward to seeing
Cool.
you again next week. I will
Alright.
let you get on
Thanks,
with your
Matt.
day.